Can you hear me, right? Ah, after this long day, and after hearing so many brilliant presentations, I actually feel quite speechless. But, we need to wind up and try to pull things together. So I want to put forward a couple of broad propositions to add to what Cosmin and Anchi have put together. By the way, thanks to them for, as always, hosting a brilliant international conference, which is, as good as the amazing shows that I always see in Parasite. And I think that one of the concerns that Parasite always has been with the issue of geography. And I find that geography is very central to the speakers we've been listening to today in very different ways. And I will try maybe in asking my questions to them to foreground this issue. The significance of geography to me, as I was listening to them, had also to do with their emphasizing the location from which they're speaking. Not in any old sense of a cultural essentialist idea of, I am from this group or this ethnicity and therefore I am empowered to speak in a particular way. I didn't hear that. I heard instead what I guess Simon would call the composite nature of people's placement of their ideas, their work, their interests and the questions they're asking. At the same time, I think it's really interesting that we have today as speakers people who are talking about geographies that are not normally part of more metropolitan discourses. We have a newly third worlding Athens. We have, Eastern Europe. Maybe it's wrong to call it that anymore. But, like for many of us in the even in the non-aligned movement to which my own country, India, belongs, Eastern Europe was really behind the Iron Curtain, as I used to say. So again, to have conversations, from that space and coming out of the really fascinating histories that we have been listening to today, was to me quite amazing. Again, Simon's invocation of Southeast Asia, Sugata's invocation of the Indian Ocean. He spoke a lot about paintings that come out of specific places, but the way they travel and the way they come to legibility has to do with an oceanic imagination. And that too I found very fascinating. Southeast Asia also lends itself to that way of thinking about geography. I didn't leave out anyone. Okay. Well, I think that listening to Katerina at the end really brought geography to the forefront of my imagination, so she doesn't need to be named. She is really the one who's, I think, foregrounding this question in really the most fascinating way possible. How can we not think about geography when we think about Banaba? So I think that what I would like to ask today, especially in Hong Kong, and what is this location, I'd like to ask the speakers to also reflect, and the people in the audience to reflect on where are we and what are we doing. And I think that to ask these two very broad questions brings to the fore some of the concerns of the speakers. And I think that you can say, where are we, what are we doing? I'm speaking out of the location of Hong Kong, although I haven't spent my entire life in Hong Kong. But it's very overpoweringly the moment in which one lives now. So speaking again from this moment and from this place, I recognize what Ileana had to say about the violence of normality and the normality of violence. I think that was really crucial, and you bring that into the discussion in Hong Kong today. Thank you for that. I would like to add to Cosmin's posing of the problem of unlearning and unschooling, something that I heard in all the speakers today, which is the uncentering or decentering, if you like, of certain, say, normative questions from art history or from thinking about artistic practice. So I'd like to pick out one word that for me encapsulated many of the things that each speaker was saying. For Ileana, I have the word violence. For Sebastian, I have the word work. For Sugata, I have two words, impossible archive. For Simon, I have connection. And for Katerina, I have remix. So it seems like everything they spoke about sort of comes back to this key concern that they were trying to address. So let me then now ask a question to each one of them and ask them to respond. For Ileana, I was very fascinated to hear about the non-aligned movement resurfacing in art practice today. I don't think you had much time to explore that. So I want to ask, and again, what is remarkable about all the speakers is that they're not trotting out the worn tropes of, we are, anti-colonial, or we are, decolonizing, or we are in a post-colonial moment. I didn't hear any of that. Instead, I think they were really looking very hard and very closely at the present, which is almost like, impossible to describe using any of those terms. I think that what we find today, again, speaking from where we are and what we see and what we do, the afterlife of the Cold War is a really huge presence. And I heard that again in different ways in what the speakers were saying. So, Ileana, how would you think about the non-aligned movement and a certain kind of resurfacing of the art practice from that time in the working out of the afterlife of the Cold War? Shall I just ask my questions and then you can just answer? For Sebastian, I was fascinated by his proposition of work as art and art as work, and also the artistic coefficient. I really love that, of all forms of work. But I wondered if those two propositions meant the same, or if they were parallel to one another, and what more could be said to re-articulate those two in some sense. I suppose it has to do with the duality of perception question in those brilliant images, but I'd like to hear more about that. For Sugata, I know I had a question here, sorry. Yes, I do. It was very complex and a very beautiful presentation. But yes, the question is about the naturalism of the representation of animals and birds that you spoke about in the early 17th century. And in some ways, this was long before humans were represented in this way in Asia, it seems to me. Because maybe I've got my art history wrong, I'm not an expert. But normally when one thinks about the pedagogic moment of realistic conventions being incorporated into Indian art practice, we're really looking at the 19th century. But I think that you brought up a very, very interesting possibility in talking about the impossibility of this archive of the Turkey, right? That is there in many ways something else happening here that complicates and maybe deregulates is what I want to say. Our idea of how artistic practices and practices of representation many ways crisscrossed with each other. And I really like here your idea of the art historian's work as a very patient act of making your cross-hatchings visible. So I would like to ask you then, how does one do that? Your archive is an impossible archive. And you did say that in this archive, you're not going to find an agent of history because there's this turkey bird that doesn't speak, that is endlessly represented. So can you speak a little more about the practice? You made it sound very seamless. You found these beautiful images, you put it all together. Tell us lay people how it's to be done. I have a similar question for Simon, because he also did this very beautifully. He spanned the entire geography of Southeast Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, everything, through the figure of the tazia, or the tabud, yeah? And the burak, the animal, the flying steed, also crisscrossing these things. I love his idea of talking about the composite rather than the hybrid. That takes it away from the older discussions about colonialism. And you do talk, Simon, about multiple historicities. Again, could you speak a little more about the method by which you track down these multiple historicities? Is it like a flash of some image, some color, some figure that comes to you, making it a particular kind of creative practice, or is also the, as in Sugata's case, the patient labor of the art historian? So since you embody both, how do you bring this together? For Katerina, I recognize that what you're doing is also a form of land art, to bring it back to Sebastian's idea. And you talked about, when I heard you talk about Banaba, I thought of Banaba as method. And while I think it's an amazing archive and it'll probably last you for the rest of your life, I wondered how you could open up other kinds of archives using Banaba as method, if you had any thoughts on that. So these are my different questions. I'm sure the audience will have more questions, but if you could have short answers to each one of these, 2 minutes each.
Shall we swap the answers?
Yeah, you can do that. I am done.
I will take Katerina.
Just pick up a mic or take this one. Yeah.
Should I be first? Okay, so I'm taking Iliana's then, like the first one. No. I will maybe. So it was okay. Art as work was work as art. Coefficient of art. Okay. Okay, so I'm being quite serious about what we are doing. You know, like I come from social science. I'm a sociologist. I have an experience of working as a social worker, like, you know, with homeless people and so on. So this is my background. And when I started to, quite early, when I started to like work with artists, write about art, I imagined that art is one of the tools, but this is a toolbox with very efficient, it's quite an efficient apparatus of creating like a change which is tangible, which you can measure. And then I discovered that this apparatus is calibrated according to some very old-fashioned, outdated regulations, like protocols, namely the 19th century model of a museum, which is based on separation of art, which is neutral, which is autonomous, in a very pejorative sense, and I mean isolated, like disconnected from reality, and which is separated from our daily life. Yeah, so there's like a lot of effort was put in creating those very rigid, very disciplined boundaries. So the wall between the real life and the museum was quite solid. Yeah? So that was the idea. Yeah? Which I think like the intentions were good. Yeah, like to save art from kind of how do you call it? Like this kind of just for serving the king, serving the church, you know, like serving the religious powers, hegemonies, and so on. So it was good to have something autonomous. But then, you know, like we are in the 21st century, and this super extravagant costume from the 19th century doesn't really fit. You know, like you feel it. It's like it's really. This is what I wanted to say. Show this image of like a famous image of punching a Nazi, which is good to punch a Nazi, because it's really the costume. This 19th century costume is like constraining our movements. You know, so we cannot really do anything. So again, so thinking about serious work to be done, we have to get rid of the costume, of this extravagant costume. And this costume consists of certain features, which is, for example, the uniqueness of work. You know, if an artist tries to change something, you know, like if she or he tries to deal, for example, with climate crisis issues, and you are like constrained to producing a unique artwork which circulates only in the kind of institutional environment, uh, which is like put in a glass box or like framed, whatever. It doesn't really have an impact. Yeah, it's so there are many ways of kind of dismantling the system and thinking about the coefficient, this art coefficient. Yeah, sorry for like referring to all those like white male that like figures, but Marcel Duchamp was really proposing this. He had like this very short lecture, like 7-minute long lecture, a nice one, like in the 50s, about the coefficient of art. You know, it's a very nice proposal. He was like proposing, imagining the coefficient as a substance, which is, you know, it's like everything is kind of infused with this substance. You know, so you can say, oh, this. Oh, what a high coefficient of art we are having here, yeah. Like, and then you're looking at the painting in the museum. It's like, oh no, it's not. That doesn't really trigger anything. It doesn't like trigger my political imagination. It doesn't have like this conceptual surplus, which is like stimulating or whatever. You know? So imagine, you know, like that. The art is much more popular, much more common, and it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. So then when you think about like our work, you know, you can say that we had this, now I can recall, we had this discussion with the so-called emerging professionals. We had this discussion about the beekeepers from Turkey who produce psychoactive honey. What a high coefficient of art, yes. What a beautiful cooperation, collaboration with those with the other species, producing psychoactive substances, helping them to build this little architecture and everything. So yeah, this is, you know, like I'm totally into like dismantling this 19th century edifice and creating, like, opening up to other opportunities. Thank you.
So I suppose, you know, every time you sort of do a presentation or present a work, it's a bit of a sleight of hand, right? Then what are you going to bound to present is something that's sweeping, it's grand, and it's seamless. But I guess the whole process of sort of doing research is always accretive, you know, and I guess it happens across the board. But you know, being in a public university also sort of like means we are always staffed for, I guess, funding resources, and you wait for opportunities where you're able to write on something that will then allow you to go to a place and hopefully, and just hopefully, being in a place somewhere else that you might be able to sort of like gain something new. And I sort of like emphasize on this principally because I'm trying to sort of like find a way to connect Hong Kong into that story based on what you have sort of proposed. So I was here a month ago where I actually first met you. And during that time, I was very ill. And I spent a lot of time walking up and down Lascar Road. Principally, I was trying to sort of like figure out, you know, what the roads, why was it sort of called Lascar Road, and was going to the mosque around the corner. And really in terms of like trying to sort of like figure out why I was so drawn to that particular place. And then I suddenly remembered that it was because for the longest time I've read this, I've seen an illustration in the London Illustrated News that featured like a sepoy mat shed that was built in Hong Kong. And it had this sort of like illustration of the mat shed. And then it sort of lead on me that, okay, I could actually sort of make the connection between the mat shed and a particular kind of like performance that grew out of the tabut in Penang. So when the tabut sort of like, when the tabut was curtailed in Penang, what happened was that it evolved into a form of performance called the Boria. And the Boria, for the longest time, people considered its etymology as being connected to Hindustani, meaning a mat or something like that, that would sort of like, do you cover yourself with during the kind of like periods of revelry. But what I find interesting about this particular image of the illustration is that it actually shows a mat shed construction. And if we then sort of like draw the connection of how the sepoys would travel across the Indian Ocean all the way up to sort of like Hong Kong, what you're able to see is that the mat not only actually shows a construction of a wooden hut, it sort of gives architectural sort of like clarity to the whole performance itself, only because it mentions in the article specifically about how the match was constructed using really much the same principles that you would see the bamboo scaffolding that you find in Hong Kong, all across Hong Kong today, right, when they do renovation work. I was very fascinated by how that is that kind of skin that you can then sort of like think in relation to how the Borea would essentially use the mat to cover themselves. That kind of like visual rhyming, I guess, and the kind of like poetic sort of like rhyming is, I guess, hard to track in terms of you were looking for actual archival sources. But I think the nice thing about doing art is that you are permitted the poetic license to make these sort of like connections, as loose as they may be. And hopefully, through making those poetic connections, it will compel me to go and look for the materials in order to actually back up what I'm sort of looking for. And what it suggests to me then it's about patience. This accretive process is about patience. But secondly, I think it's also about passion, like not being able to sleep. As I'm sort of like trying to figure these things out. I thought I would never have this after my PhD life.
No, so I'm glad we brought up the question of geography and geopolitics in a way as a product of the British Empire. Thinking about Kashmir, Palestine, and Hong Kong today opens up this question of what are we writing and whom are we writing for? And it's not a coincidence that these three vestiges of geopolitical governance of the empire are in a way trying to negotiate a new way of becoming. That in a way also leads to my own interest in trying to think about other terrains, other affinities, other ways of thinking, a longitudinal history. The term Global South is now used to talk about certain political affiliations of the 20th century. But for me, what I'm really keen on thinking about is that this is not just a 20th century phenomenon. It's not even a late 19th century phenomenon. There's a longer history of thinking affinities across terrains that have not been explored because of certain political, ideological conceptualizations of the world in a post-war world. So for me, the idea of trying to think about what the Americas means from Mughal India, or what the America opens up this question of other affinities and other ways of imagining the world. And the question of reading archives, I'm a very conservative art historian, so so slow looking is very important. So I spend, like in my class, there's this exercise that my students and I do is looking at one painting for half an hour, 30 minutes, and trying to see how line works and how shape works, how color works. But along with close reading, there is another important part of trying to think about art history from the present, that is reading against the grain. And Mansour, in a way, is your Caravaggio, is your Picasso. I mean, there are tons of books on Mansour from the 1920s. So I go back to this master of Mughal art, and I'm like, how can we rethink the world from that painting? What are the tracts, what are the cross-hatchings that can emerge if you go back to that canonical moment and try to imagine a certain worldliness from that painting? So for me, close reading is of course important, but along with close reading, close looking, it's also about how do we push the archive against its grain. And of course, I mean, Gayatri Spivak. I mean, there's a long genealogy there in trying to think about archives in different ways.
Thank you for your question, because I was very eager to actually talk about the Cold War. I'm going to start to try to be with the 2 minutes and be a bit personal. First of all, I don't think I have the right or the capability to speak about Hong Kong. But what I can say is that what I read from the newspapers, which is all these that has been happening for the last months, which for me are signs that you can find throughout the globe of people somehow tapping on things and waking up. And for me, that for one is important. But Cold War. So, I think the Second World War for me is an extremely important moment, again, coming from the place of Greece. And I want to link it to the non-aligned movement because we never got onto that train. Because, of course, the left in Greece lost. They were persecuted, they were imprisoned for decades. My grandfather was one of these people, and therefore we never had the chance to actually form those types of alliances. That's a small asterisk, so I will try to bind both. For me, the Cold War basically kind of underlines the beginning of neoliberalism, and it's an extremely important moment for us to look at now, to look back in the past, to understand what has happened to us and why we're dealing with what we're dealing today. And I think a lot of, not only in the cultural field of obviously, but the non-aligned movement as well as the Pan-African movement, and now a lot of artists dealing with Afrofuturism, is exactly because it feels like a missed opportunity that didn't have the chance to develop enough. And it feels like a solution of a different type of transnationalism alliances that are not through this neoliberal logic. And this, for me, is extremely important. This is the question for the future, if there is one question and if there is future, of how can we actually form these types of alliances. I was very happy with Katerina's presentation. It was a brilliant presentation, but one particular moment that you mentioned Europe, and you said, in parentheses, the countries. And I was like, because I'm from Greece. We don't have a colonial past, and I don't recognize myself as a white subjectivity that, is carrying all this with them. And I think it's important, especially, you also mentioned it with Eastern Europe, to really make this distinction of also this third party that is an ally for all the more brown and the even more brown for exactly these types of alliances. Eastern Europe is an excellent example. This kind of middle sliver of the Balkans that Greece also belongs to. And I think we need to kind of unearth the histories in order to find the tools for the future. And the non-aligned movement was possibly the most hopeful moment. And it shows, I think, how because of phosphate, because of oil, because of all types of extractions, it was squashed for particular interests. And now at least we have these knowledges more clear because it's a historical moment that is quite far. At least for me, that I'm 39 years old.
So you sort of had two questions in there. One was about Banaba and the Banaban archive, but then also Banaba as method. So in my work, I will always be sticking with the Banaban archive, even as I do other things, wholly because I consider myself fulfilling a particular kind of role that Banaban women have always been tasked with. So when the phosphate mining came to Banaba, women actually put their arms around the trees and held on to the trees in the face of the tractors that was standing there, and men tried to pull the women off the trees. So my way of continuing that kind of like holding the land is to always stick with that archive and follow the rocks wherever they are, continuing that stewardship that women are tasked with, even if you can't see the particles of the rocks. And so I will be teaching my daughters to do that, which makes sense in Australia because our land has been spread across the fields of Australia. So I still have this very multi-sided and placed notion of indigeneity, even though it is very much in a mobile diasporic context. And then to take that further, the way in which my work has informed other people working on Indigenous mobilities is a group of master's and PhD students at the University of Hawaii decided to coin the term diasporox as a result of reading my book, Consuming Ocean Island, and going, oh, rather than just talking about the flows of culture and knowledge and concepts across the Pacific diaspora, what if we followed, the actual tangible material dimensions of Tongan diasporas or Samoan diasporas or Marshallese diasporas and displacements due to American nuclear testing in the Pacific. So other people are already doing Banaba as method by following the logic of my work, which for me is that multi-sited, multi-scalar, transdisciplinary kind of approach to everything.
Thank you all for these really brilliant answers. Maybe you hold on until someone asks another question, because we need to take questions from the audience. So I just want to abuse my privilege as the moderator. And before I ask people to raise hands, I just want to say that it's amazing what the speakers have done for me. Just to bring in another set of words here. We talked about un and di. I want to bring in re as well. So I think that they've helped me in many ways to show how refocusing of our priorities can be done. And they do that by redescribing the kind of material they're looking at, whether it's from the 15th century or from the present, and by reinscribing a certain set of concerns. So I think that what I see in all of them, whether they're more from the scholarly side or more from the curatorial or the artistic side, there is a certain energy of cultural activism that animates all the work that all of these people have been talking about. And what that results in is then, the last re of the evening, to reposition, to borrow from Sebastian's idea, the work of art, and the work of art, and the art of work. So thank you all, and questions from the audience. About 10 minutes, 15 minutes, Cosmin? Yeah, 15.
We have more. We have lots of time.
You do? I was told this finishes at 7 o'clock. Oh, 8? Oh, okay. Ah, okay, they'll all get another. Are you sure? Okay, they'll all get another round. Okay, please ask lots of interesting questions, and then all of them will speak again.
Yeah, we can go on until like 7:45.
We are exhausted.
Work.
Okay.
With a glass of wine.
Well, I think that we will, in honor of the speakers and in acknowledgement of their tiredness, I think we will take maybe like 5 or 6 questions, and then we'll see how it goes.
So, if I may, I will start. And as we know, Cosmin, if it's good, Cosmin never has enough. So we could go on all night. Left to him. Thank you very much also from my side. The presentations I kind of was part of were very, 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 very interesting, and very happy that I've been here, and I'll just ask my question. To Shugata and to Simon, which I was privileged to listen to all of what you guys said. And also in thinking of the reinscription and the repositioning and so on, I was really fascinated by the reading of Mansour's work in the context. And in both of your presentations, of course, the Indian Ocean comes in and plays an important role. But another thing that I think plays another role and that needs a reinscription is the notion of abstraction. So why do I say that? So if Simon is looking at the composite, maybe Shugata is looking at the decomposite. In the sense that 2 years before the painting of the turkey, Mansour paints the tulip of Kashmir. A similar thing happens there. So he takes away the landscape almost completely. So it's almost just a yellow surface, and you have this tulip kind of like flying or hanging in the air. So I'm interested in this erasure, this kind of a decomposition that he does there. And I'm saying this also because you mentioned Alfred Barr and his genealogy of the history of abstraction and whatever. And I'm talking about abstraction not in the sense of what abstraction should necessarily mean, but in the drawing away, So, which I think the Burak would be as well, that kind of a compositeness of it comes in as a certain form of abstraction. So I thought you guys could speak of that notion of abstraction as a common denominator in the presentations you gave.
So, talking about Mansour's work, scholarship has seen this abstraction or this sort of removal of landscape as sort of a unrelenting westernization, because that's what happens, say, from Dürer onwards, precisely in European natural history, the emergence of these representations of the natural world, of plants, animals, without context, without background, without the environment, and it's part of the new scientificism, the specimen logic that emerges in Europe. Now, which also goes back to the question of reading the archive, and that's how histories of Mughal painting have seen it, is that you have European engravings coming to India, Mansour and other artists are looking at these European illustrations, and they are becoming more scientific in the logic of Western scientificism, very precise. And that's where I was like, but there must be another history to this. Why does it always have to be read as sort of a diffusionist model, that a certain logic of scientific abstraction is invented by Dürer, and then it's globally exported? Latin America, South Asia. So for me, then I was like, okay, but you're talking about plants, animals. What pressure are these beings? How are they pressurizing painting practices? And that's where I started thinking about, what if abstraction or the decontextualization is a mode of unbelongingness, is a mode of thinking the other, an other that you dwell with. So for me, that allowed me to take it beyond that sort of a model of saying science is invented in the West and it's sort of globally exported, and artists and architects and patrons are all looking towards that sort of moment of natural history in Europe. And and also the question of Europe, when I use the word Europe, I do not mean the geographic space called Europe. I mean, drawing from Dipesh Chakraborty, the idea of a hyperreal Europe, which is also a problem for the geopolitical space called Europe. So Europe in that sense is a concept more than the geography called Europe.
Glissant calls it a project, right? A project. Yeah, no, thank you so much, Bonaventure, for your question. Actually, it's very helpful in clarifying what Alfred Barr, how Alfred Barr actually defines abstraction, right? I think he opens his book with almost like, in a way that was in some ways helping or facilitating his an audience in the early 20th century who was not familiar with the language of abstraction, and basically sort of suggesting that you can think of abstraction as a noun that contains both an adjective and a verb. And I think the adjective is pretty sort of like clear. But the verb, I think, is what you're also sort of like suggesting there. It's this idea that it can be constantly sort of like recomposite. That the composite is in some ways facilitates the recomposition of sort of like figures, forms, and everything into something else altogether. And that to me is sort of like a very exciting way of thinking about how I can sort of actually clarify I actually sort of like distinguish the Burak and what's the kind of like modernism that I'm trying to sort of actually argue in Tengku Tengku's sort of like painting as in comparison to I guess what you would normally find in the standard canon of Cubism and abstract art. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for incredible presentations. My question is for Sugata, and I was very, very intrigued by your presentation, and of course by the possibility that you posed to us on the kind of an anthropocentric approach to art history, and this is so relevant in this kind of context of thinking about geography and colonialism, precisely because that would entail an anthropocentric, post-anthropocentric approach. So, in thinking about these. This evocation that you did towards the end of your presentation about animal visualities or other visualities that would, in this case, constitute an animal visuality. I wanted to see if you could further elaborate on how or what this interspecies scopic regime looks like, or how could it be further unpacked? And this is, I should say, it's a speculative question. I'm not trying to like get a straight answer from you. But if we were to speculate, how would this interspecies scopic regime look like, or how can we get closer to that? And I ask that because, of course, the field of art history is dominated by this form of oculocentrism. So how to think of the world from the perspective of a Turkey. This does not simply ask about modes of representation or vision as representation, but of developing an other than human consciousness through other modes of being and knowing with the Turkey.
I'm glad you asked me this question. I'm doing a talk at Brown on speculation. So I was like, how do I have to say about speculation? I'm glad you gave me an entry to thinking about speculation. I am interested in art history that is not scopic, because the scopic regime is precisely that sort of a master eye that I see you, I map you, I know you, I govern you. And for me, a form of writing, a form of thinking, of kinship that is beyond that sort of a act of seeing as governance. So for me, for instance, I do not use the word landscape, I use the word land, because landscape is part of that sort of a cartographic, scopic regime. And Tim Ingold would write that the transition from land to landscape happens when you see and you control and you occupy the land in that sense. So in your work, where there's a very different engagement with land, with animals, with plants, with other forms of being sentient or otherwise. And my own interest in art history is trying to push art history beyond that sort of a European, hyperreal Europe, European conception of art history as a form of governance, as a form of knowledge production. But what would the world look like if we were trying to think about the Turkey as not just either an allegory or a form of governance, but really thinking about that relationship. But again, this is a project that would fail precisely because of the impossibility of the archive. Because there is no way I can, in a way, access the 16th century, 17th century Turkey. So, but it opens up art history beyond that sort of early modern, colonial, cartographic mode of scopic domination.
There are no Turkey dancing or oral traditions?
The Turkey comes, the first Turkey probably arrives in India in 1612. So there is no... So the turkey is always an exotic bird, and I think in Malay it's called Dutch chicken, or yeah. So it's always from elsewhere, yeah. And I think for me what is interesting is this difference. No, there are other animals.
Dutch chicken sounds so weird when you speak it.
What is it in Malay?
Yeah, it's true. It's ayam belanda.
Thank you all of you for amazing and inspiring talks. And I have a question to Sebastian. You were speaking about this idea of 19th century museum constraining what today's artistic practice, and that today's artistic practice basically doesn't fit into these constraints. And I was wondering, what is the direction of rethinking, of reimagining institutions today to kind of like embrace this this different art, this art in post-artistic times?
Thanks for the rating live.
Okay, there's even like this term like Museum 3.0, but I have no idea what it is. I was trying to investigate this concept, like this proposal of more like collectively produced entirety, which is serving the needs of like local communities and other constituencies. But I think, like, yeah, again, to be like serious about it, like being in the very moment where we are now, with the rise of the far right, with the climate crisis, and like it's this creeping, crawling monster, facing the new dark ages. We have to also think about what is to be saved. Like, what are we actually saving? What are we trying to rescue? As if you think about institutions, like what is the use of our, archives and collections and all those, programs and jargon and vocabulary, like what is the use? So basically, I think that we should think about museums in like two ways. Like I propose this term of a sanctuary, which is quite a legal understanding of what a sanctuary is, and it applies to some legal system in some of the countries, like I guess in Canada, for example, but also even like in the States, you have like sanctuary cities. Yes, when you So and for example, there's also like this example of like like people who are like refugees, for example, hiding in churches. And then you cannot, like at least in most of the European countries, you cannot arrest a person during a Catholic mass, or like it's like this rule, like so there were like some priests who were like conducting masses for like days or weeks, like so people continuously, so people were safe. So I think we should be sanctuaries, like like legally, like I'm being really down to earth about it, like those kind of safe enclaves. I can give you. I don't want to like really talk about like my practice or like our practice of the museum, but I mean it's quite a. I think it's quite a handy example. Like we have this residency program in the museum, which is aimed at kind of troubled communities or like institutions. I would say institutions. Yeah, it's not for individuals; it's for groups, collectives, and so, for example, like those nomadic, homeless, queer dance company were kind of embraced by us. So they used our resources to produce a program, and we used their energy, kind of, like so. In biology, you would call it a mutualism, when you have like two parasites, not really parasites, like feeding on each other, like like squeezing out the energy. So yeah, So the sanctuary is one of the like metaphors or like legal kind of solutions, but the other would be a greenhouse, which is more like kind of allegory of a place where you cultivate very sensitive creatures, like living entities, when you take care of something which might grow stronger and survive beyond like the structure, the system. So when you can support certain practices or like certain it's about cultivating ideas, or even sometimes it's about cultivating tomatoes, like it's about cultivating, cultivation is a good thing, like helping those beings grow. And so I should introduce also like it's about rewilding. Yeah, yeah. It's about rewilding. So that's the like term for the future museums. Rewilding the planet. Yeah.
So I said, if nobody has a question, I'll ask another one for Katerina. Also, fascinating presentation, and I was thinking about the map you presented. You know, where your research has taken you to, or the kind of places you're mapping. And I wanted to ask about, and you said I think something along the lines of if the finances would allow, you would go to Europe and so on and so forth. But I wanted to ask you about, regimes of extractivisms, be it phosphate, be it uranium in Niger, and so on and so how could one imagine that, and somebody mentioned something about alliances, how could one think of this mapping of these regimes of extractivisms in different spaces, geographical spaces again, but with the concept behind being, the fact that things are being extracted, bodies as well,
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things I'm trying to do by following the itineraries, right, following the routes of the commodities, the chain of commodities, while staying rooted on Banaba, is to think about the different kinds of kinships and alliances the flow of our land sets up. So the most obvious tension in there is the one of extraction, of colonial extraction, of imperial extraction, and of consumption, which sets up this like horrible kind of problem, particularly from an indigenous perspective, but I feel like it also sets up opportunities for dialogue around maybe the kinds of kinships you're talking about. So it's not just interspecies kinships, but it's transgeographic rooted kinships where a lot of people think because of diaspora, because of displacement, because of slavery, because of the violent movement of bodies, that you have to give up being rooted, that, you are forever severed from that emplacement. And I know about the problems around emplacement and how that can lead to all kinds of nationalisms and bad things that I'm not trying to go there. It's about actually bringing us back to the kinship with the environment, not in some kind of romantic, what natives do kind of way, but rather seriously thinking about the extractive processes that have brought us to this crisis that we are in today. So by tracking Banaba, I feel like it sets up other possibilities for strategizing around the kinds of ontologies and epistemologies that are required to not fuck up the planet again, which we seem destined to do by coming up with ridiculous technical solutions that kind of bring us back to the problem, of where we started. So I'm really about these deep kinships, with rocks. One of the first things people said to me when I entered an anthropology department in the Australian National University, which is this very classical social anthropology kind of space, was natives aren't so stupid, they don't believe rocks actually speak. And that then became my whole, I will show you exactly how rocks speak and have, you know, have purpose and intention and fell from the sky and from which we were born. So I'm really talking about like seriously getting back to the land, to specific land, not so that it can just feed you, because we're always thinking, you know, in that anthropocentric way, what can I get out of it so I can keep living my fabulous life? I'm talking about like, you know, like seriously dealing with material ground on which we exist. And that means tracking all of those resources, but then thinking about them in a more of a kinship and genealogical kind of relationality, rather than just, you know, flows of commodities like the sugar that came out of the Caribbean, which then flew back to, you know, Europe, blah, 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 blah. Europe. Europe. Yeah. But does that make sense? Because then for me we can have those serious, like, you know, serious discussions between, you know, the global south, between Africa, the Caribbean, the Pacific, you know, and I have actually had some of these discussions where we had to get back to like the ancestral roots, which were painful for some of the participants, but we opened up the possibility that you don't have to know everything. You don't have to know exactly which family, which place, whatever, to continue to invoke that deep grounding. So really I'm talking about grounding, like serious gut level grounding.
I think which we haven't mentioned yet is also the way that toxicity travels. And a colleague of mine that is actually opening a show now at Savvy, Antonia Lampi, is working lately a lot with that, which has, I mean, this is another way of actually tracking different kinships of what type of waste do we dump upon another, which is like a shared pollution in a way, in a different way than what we think, or just the air that is polluted or is traveling and everything. And just before, when we first started, I just wanted to add an incredible project that artist Femke Herregraven did, which I commissioned for an exhibition a year ago, which is looking at the island of the Mauritius and the Chagos Islands, which also, I mean, seeing your story, or hearing your lecture and knowing about the story, it really felt very similar in the sense that the unexpected was the lawsuit. And the lawsuit that doesn't stop, that continues and continues and continues for years and years. I mean, in the case of the Chagosians, thank God, you know, for once possibly, the law actually operated, and now it was a few months ago that the British are forced to admit basically that they have destructed the whole island. But when you said, oh, it didn't work, and of course it wouldn't, I thought, yeah, well, even if it was, you know, a verdict that would be for your side, the British have done nothing the last 6 months, and it's a UN decision, it's International Criminal Court decision. And I mean, it shows again what I spoke of in the morning, this narcissistic authoritarianism of, you know, these bodies have no power over me, which I am still the empire. So, but yeah, I just wanted to add that there are so many, I mean, these are very nice routes to actually start trying to discover from also the side of the non.
The last question. Like, we have the shuttle bus is coming earlier, so we'll take a short picture after this, and then we will be like good to go. Last question.
They've really sung for the supper, so I think we should let them go. But maybe Cosmin will have a question for the whole panel.
Oh, well, I have all the ones prepared for tomorrow, for the January session, so so I'm gonna keep them for tomorrow.
Anyone else? Any last question?
Yes, the workshop parties. Actually, last years we had a rule that there always had to be like at least 2 questions. So we were good.
Hi, I have a weird question though. since yeah, it's okay. I mean, I feel like thank you so much for today. I really enjoyed the talks today because I'm also interested in geographies, and thank you for the moderator for bringing that up. Since yeah, it's about this whole reposition rewilding. I was wondering, should and since there's a lot of talk on animals today somehow and nature, and so does that mean the artworks that should or visual art or whatever visual culture that there is in the future, should it talk about that again, like animals or showing the images of animals again or nature again to, I don't know, remind each other of this, I mean, the non-human beings around us, or don't know. I know it's a weird question, but yeah.
Well, I mean, I have a feeling that it's also a little bit of a direction already taken for a couple of years because of Donna Haraway as well. There is like everybody talking about these non-human alliances and kinships. Of course, these are questions that have been addressed for decades before Haraway. But I mean, if my humble opinion, it's not should we. There is no should in that. It's just that the end is near somehow. I mean, now it's proven we can't avoid it. We can't say that we're just being pessimistic. It's 30 to 40 years maximum. Therefore, we need to start thinking in a transhuman way, that it's beyond the human. And is that a comradeship with non-human entities that are animals? Yes, sure, why not? But it could be so many other things. And I mean, I have to say that this is again not a new question. It already started with Russian constructivism when they were thinking of the object as a comrade and as an active agent. So, I mean, why not? Since the end is near in any case.
Inca stonework, much before the Russian constructivists.
Indigenous people have been doing
it
far
before
constructivism was even an idea.
I can also add like an optimistic note. Like it's when you like switch to a kind of geological time, perspective, deep time. Like even the Banaba Island will be like recovered. Like it's really in 1 million year there will be like no traces of humans. Like there will be like new organisms. They will like it's relaunching, relaunching the planet, restarting it. Yes.
Thanks to the lovely audience, thanks to all the speakers, and thanks to the shuttle bus that's waiting to take us.
Thank you. Thank you.